Welcome to this presentation covering the topic of religious discrimination. Let's begin. So we have several topics that we're going to be covering in this module. We'll do a little introduction to the topic, then we'll discuss what we mean when we say something is a religion or is a religious belief. Next, we'll talk about the prima facie case and how that presents itself in the religious discrimination context. We'll talk about the duty to reasonably accommodate religious beliefs. We've talked very briefly about this in previous lectures. This will be our first opportunity to really dive into the topic of reasonable accommodation. The related concept is undue hardship. When is something so difficult to reasonably accommodate that it becomes an undue hardship? So we'll talk about when that line is crossed. Then we'll talk about the special topic of religious proselytizing and religious harassment. Actually, these are two separate topics. We'll briefly touch on a union's duty with respect to religion, and we'll talk about the special issues that are in play when an organization itself is religious. What are its obligations under the law? We'll probably focus on these first two, though, in this presentation. So let's begin. Obviously, religion has been an important motivator of people's conduct since the beginning of all time, most likely, and we've seen in Western culture and Western traditions, including our traditions here in the United States, that religion can often impact decisions that people make in their lives, and this can obviously relate to their work lives. Our Constitution, of course, grew out of that tradition, that era. And so we see in the Constitution itself two important protections that appear in the First Amendment. And they have to do with the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And these are the two parts of our Constitution that people are usually referring to when they talk about separation of church and state. Now, as we've said before, constitutional issues really don't have much play in employment discrimination unless your employer is a public employer, such as a state or the federal government or a city for that matter. If we're talking about private employers, we don't really have the constitutional protections available to individuals. But we do have Title VII, which does provide substantial protections to individuals who are being impacted because of their religious belief systems. And so that's going to be the focus of our presentation today. Here's just a very brief overview of the diversity of opinions on issues of religion. And we can see here that the largest group, we're going to use the term Christianity, although we can see this group is very, very diverse. Many of the people in this group, there should actually be a comma here, would not agree with the other people being in this group. And so these are not necessarily individuals who share the same views. And so it can well be, as we know historically, the Protestants and the Catholics in Ireland have been very tense, and other groups within this category oftentimes have tense relationships with other groups in the category. So we also know in Islam, which is our second largest group, Shiite and Sunni Muslims sometimes have tensions in that area as well. You can see that our third largest group are the non-religious, and this can involve people who have a variety of different viewpoints that are not necessarily consistent with each other. And then, of course, we start getting into very small groups. And so the point that I hope you'll take from this is that in the world, there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the religious beliefs people have, including having no religious beliefs at all. Here we are in the United States, and again, that same diversity with respect to Christianity exists, that we described here exists here. So we oftentimes find within the 76%, a lot of people who would not agree that the other person belongs to the definition of Christian. And of course, left off this list is the nones or the atheists and agnostics. But if you look and add up this percentages, you can say that they are at least 20%. I think that this data may actually be a little bit old, and we might actually see that that number of people who don't have a religious belief system has actually grown a little bit. And we are also seeing increases in the number of Muslims in our country. And certainly in our community, we see a higher number of Hindus than other parts of the country might experience. So this is an indication that we have a very diverse culture here, even though certainly Christianity remains our most important in terms of numbers of all of the religions. So traditionally, when people talk about Title VII, we're talking about differences. So we're talking about somebody being discriminated against because he's a Catholic. Well, the person discriminating obviously isn't a Catholic, or perhaps because she is of the Jewish faith. Again, the person discriminating probably isn't Jewish, or because he's a Muslim, etc., etc. Many times these definitions also have a national origin component. The Muslim perhaps is from Indonesia or the Middle East. The Jewish person might be an Ashkenazi Jew or Sephardic Jew. There's an ethnic component to that for many folks, not by no means all folks. Catholics oftentimes are identified as being Hispanic, or they might be Italian, or they might be Irish. And again, there typically or oftentimes is a ethnic component to those categories. So sometimes it can be hard to tell whether the person is being discriminated against because of his or her national origin or because his or her religion. And in some cases, especially with Judaism, there may not really be a separation, even conceptually, between the ethnicity and the faith. We are seeing a trend. I mean, certainly we will always have this category of discrimination, so I don't want to make it sound like this is going away. It will continue to be an important source of Title VII claims, but we're seeing more and more claims where it's not so much about the belief system being different from other folks, but how it's being expressed. For example, we might have workers who are interested in proselytizing or converting or evangelizing others. And it might be that the manager actually shares, for the most part, the religious beliefs of the proselytizer, but feels that those efforts are disruptive of the work environment. So you might have a Baptist manager uh, uh, being involved in a situation where you have a Baptist employee. They both subscribe primarily to, or basically to the same belief system, but the Baptist employee may be proselytizing, and that may cause some tensions between him or her and the manager. And so sometimes it can even be, you can have these tensions even when the two individuals, in many senses, agree with the faith that the person complaining is expressing. We've talked briefly about affinity groups before, but this is a good word to add to your Quizlet if you don't already have it. Affinity groups are groups of individuals who share a particular interest or a particular characteristic. And it can be something as innocent and harmless as, you know, the crocheters in a particular organization. Maybe they meet for lunch and they crochet while they talk about patterns for crocheting. Or it could be another group that is interested in a television show that they all seem to enjoy watching. Or many times affinity groups are focused on a particular ethnicity. For example, it might be the African American affinity group or the Hispanic affinity group. When I was at JCPenney, we had those types of affinity groups and they were highly encouraged. But they weren't exclusive. Everyone was welcome to attend, even though the focus of the presentations might be tailored especially to people who are members of that group. Some of my very most memorable times uh, at JCPenney were listening to the affinity groups. I can remember one person who was so powerful speaker. If you ever have a chance to hear him, I highly recommend it. He is the president of Paul Quinn College in South Dallas, and his name is Michael Sewell. And oh my gosh, such an amazing speaker. I just was so wowed by him. Anyway, I was privileged to attend that, and again, it was the African American Affinity Group because Paul Quinn is an historically African American university. But just so powerful to me that presentation. I was also involved in the Hispanic Affinity Group, and they also had awesome speakers. Um, but some groups, though, some places of employment do restrict who can attend those types of presentations. And so people have to be affiliated in some sense with the group. That's a pretty dangerous position to take. I'm going to let you know. It's much better to, if you're going to have affinity groups, is to make them open to everyone. And even if the topics might be of special interest to some folks over other folks. But we're not focusing on the racial dynamic in this presentation today. We're focusing on the religious possibilities. And this is a bit of a more dangerous area to have affinity groups that are focused on a particular religion. Now, let me pause and say that I'm not talking about informal groups. It's not at all unusual in a workplace to have an informal group of friends who get together to have a Bible study or a prayer meeting over their lunch period or maybe their break or before or after work. Those types of groups have always happened, and I'm sure they'll always continue to happen. And since there's no employer sanctioning or involvement in that, it's really kind of a non-issue from that perspective. But once the employer gets involved in it, it can become a bit more dicey to have these groups. So if the employer, for example, is providing dedicated space or is providing catered snacks for the event, it becomes more problematic when it is uh, tied to a specific religious goal. For example, the Christian Bible study or the Jewish Torah study or the Muslim Quran study. Those would be a little bit more uh, controversial because, again, going back to the African American Hispanic affinity groups to which I was affiliated, they were groups that were very welcoming of people who did not fit that particular demographic, and they could be very rewarding for people who did not fit that demographic. But if it really was a Bible study, unless a person was a Christian or was thinking about becoming a Christian, it probably wouldn't be something that that person would be overly comfortable attending because it wasn't just a historical examination of the Bible. It would also have some spiritual components and religious components. And similarly, a Torah study or a Quran study would fit into those characteristics. So some employers have prohibited affinity groups that are based upon religion. Again, I'm not saying that they don't still have those groups meeting in the cafeteria, sitting around the table, reading the Bible or the Quran or other religious tasks. But when there is the official sanction, that's when it becomes more dicey. Also, many employers prohibit majority-based groups. For example, the white men's club would probably most employers would not go for. They might have an African American men's club, but they're not going to have a Caucasian or white men's club simply because that group of folks is the majority of folks. And so the particular networking goals that they would have would essentially be excluding the individuals who are probably in most need of that kind of networking resource. And so those are pretty commonly excluded. So if you work for a client that is thinking about setting up affinity groups, these are questions that you need to think through when you're giving them advice to see whether this is something that is in keeping with their culture and in keeping with where the law is in terms of are these potentially dicey concerns to have or not. And of course, if you allow the Christian Bible study, then obviously you're going to have to fund the Muslim Quran study on the same terms and the Hindu prayer group, et cetera, et cetera. You won't be able to favor one group over another based in the religious area. So again, you might need to have the atheist free thinking group or the agnostic uh, inquiring group or something along those lines. One of the challenges with religious discrimination matters is that many of the events in many faiths are tied to the calendar and to the clock. We see this with set times of prayer in Islam. We see that with set holy days in both Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And then there can be faiths who have other special days. For example, in the Jewish faith, Rosh Hashanah; in the Christian faith, Easter and Christmas; in the Muslim faith, you have Ramadan and other holidays. And so sometimes special days may be especially important where the worker needs to take off time from work or may need to take off special time for prayer during the course of the day. A workplace that is going 24/7 can make that challenging to allow that kind of religious observance. In addition, after 9/11, there was heightened discrimination against people of the who are Muslim, and also people who might be of other faiths, but who the average person on the street might not understand that was a different faith. So, for example, there was a fair amount of discrimination against Hindus and Sikhs, even though Hindus and Sikhs had, obviously, the vast majority of Muslims had nothing to do with 9/11 either, but the people who were involved in 9/11 were at least nominally Muslims. But Sikhs and Hindus weren't involved at all. And yet, because sometimes people couldn't make the distinction or didn't understand the distinction between the faiths, those individuals sometimes were discriminated against as well. Another issue is that for some people who are religious, there isn't a separation. You don't have your component in your life that is work and your component of life that is religious. You just have one life that you're living, and all parts of it maybe contain all of those elements. And so you can't compartmentalize if that's the way that you view religion. So let's consider the topic of religious discrimination. Okay, so what are the kind of key terms that we're going to be looking at when we talk about religious discrimination? Well, if we're looking at public employees, we do need to consider constitutional guarantees. We talked about that with respect to the First Amendment. The 14th Amendment can also be important. But as I said before, this course we're focusing on the private employee situation. We just don't have enough time to do a deep dive into both topics. And so we talk about due process, which is the 14th Amendment; equal protection, which is the 14th Amendment; and the First Amendment, freedom of religion. For the most part, religious institutions like churches, religious schools, sometimes religious medical facilities, charities like Salvation Army, those types of groups are largely exempt from Title VII. And we see the way that they're exempt is the ministerial exception. And the term ministerial in this context is not just applied to Christianity. Even religions that don't use the term minister might use the term imam or rabbi or some other term. They are still entitled to the ministerial exception. And the ministerial exception, even within Christianity, is broader than perhaps we might use the term minister for. If a person is in a spiritual role, even though they don't have the term minister, they can be subject to the ministerial exception. We'll talk more about its scope and its reason for existence later on in a later presentation. And then, of course, we have BFOQ, the bona fide occupational qualifications. We've already talked about those in the context of national origin and sex, but they also can apply in the categories of religion. There can be certain jobs that you need to be of a certain faith in order to work in that job. The example I've used previously is in order to have food certified as kosher, you need to have a rabbi to validate that the correct process was followed in order for it to be considered kosher. So a BFOQ for that role would be to be a rabbi. Obviously, you have to be Jewish to be a rabbi. So then it would be a BFOQ to be Jewish for that particular role. We also see this in academia, wherein if I'm, say, teaching at a seminary, we'll say it's a Catholic seminary. It makes sense that those positions might be reserved for Catholics only, even though obviously a Lutheran or a Jewish person or an atheist could know the theological framework for Catholicism and be able to teach that accurately and in an effective way. But of course, the people in the seminary would say it isn't just a matter of intellectually mastering the material, there's also spiritual formation. And a person who doesn't share our journey in terms of our spiritual life wouldn't be the person who would be able to develop those spiritual insights for the students. So BFOQs in the areas of education are pretty common. We've even seen cases where really secular type activities can also fit into this category where religious institutions can not be worried about Title VII. There's a case where the Latter-day Saints, which some of you may know as the Mormons, um, had a gym janitor, and you would think, well, a gym janitor, that's not really a minister. There's no real need for that person to be of a particular religion. I mean, obviously, you don't clean the toilets differently if you're a Hindu versus a Mormon versus a Presbyterian. But the Latter-day Saints church was able to persuade the court that yes, it was something that was important that this person be a member of the congregation. We'll talk again more about the religious aspects in later presentations. I just kind of wanted to introduce you to the concept now. So these are two really important concepts. I know we've talked about these before, but this is where we really focus on them to a higher degree. We'll also talk about this topic when we talk about Americans with Disabilities Act, disability discrimination. So employers in the context of religious discrimination have a duty to reasonably accommodate. So we're going to call that this duty. This is going to start here. They have to seek to avoid conflict between workplace policies and an employee's religious beliefs or practices. We don't see a duty to reasonably accommodate in the areas of sex discrimination, national origin discrimination, race discrimination, color discrimination, or age discrimination. There's no duty to reasonably accommodate in those contexts. We only see the duty to reasonably accommodate in the area of religion and in the area of disability. So this puts a minimum level that the employer has to do. So the employer's duty is going to go from here up to here. An employer is not satisfying its duty if it's down here. It's not doing enough. It needs to do at least this much. Undue hardship is the upper boundary. And again, this is a term for your Quizlet. If the burden to accommodate the employee's religious duties is too onerous, too difficult, too hard, the employee doesn't have to bear it. So that's the upper limit. So up here, an employer can do this part, the blue area, but doesn't have to. Now, of course, there's no obvious lines. I'm acting like there's this clear-cut line here and a clear-cut line here, but no, there isn't. Where this line is, you know, a reasonable person might think it's anywhere in this area. A reasonable person might think it's anywhere in this area. And so deciding whether the line is here or here or here or here involves looking at the cases, seeing where the cases are recently in your particular jurisdiction. And you'll find that there is some fluidity in where these locations are. Here's some other key terms. First is sincerely held. So this is, again, for your, all these terms in red would be excellent for Quizlet. This is a fact-specific finding determination. I might remove this word here. A fact-specific determination as to an employee's fidelity to religious beliefs and practices. This is almost impossible for an employer to challenge unless you have some kind of smoking gun. Let me give you a story from my experience. We had a worker who he was actually a manager who was ethnically Jewish. It hadn't been an important part of his faith, or his Judaism had not been an important part of his life, at least from what his coworkers could see. For many, many years, he had been employed by the company for, gosh, at least 10 years, probably more than that. He was somebody who he worked regularly on Fridays and Saturdays, did not keep kosher, would eat bacon, would eat shrimp, didn't seem to go to the temple, uh, didn't seem to be an important part of his life. He was proud of being a Jewish, but it wasn't something that was a religious component to it. There didn't seem to be from that standpoint. Anyway, this gentleman got a divorce from his wife, and he had a couple of kids. And as part of the divorce, the terms of the divorce, he would get the kids every other spring break. His kids were school aged, and so there was a specific week, where the schools would be closed for spring break. And he had sometimes Christmas, sometimes Thanksgiving, variation from that perspective. Anyway, in a retail environment, as you can imagine, you don't really want a lot of your workers to be off for spring break because many times spring break would be close to when Easter would be. And Easter, especially several years ago, was a pretty big time for people to buy Easter dresses, Easter hats, and other items related to Easter, maybe Easter baskets, things like that. And so this was a time where you would want to staff your store pretty well so that when people came in doing Easter shopping, you would have sufficient staffing available. So the store manager said that managers could not have spring break off this year because of the need, because Easter happened to be in that same time period. Well, this manager wanted to take his children to, I think it was Walt Disney World. And but he knew that the answer was going to be no. Well, it just so happened that, not Rosh Hashanah, but Passover, sorry about that, was going to be at the same time as well. And so he went to his store manager and said, I have decided to become more in touch with my Judaism and expose my children in more detail to our shared Jewish faith by spending this time um, uh, Passover, really getting in touch with our Jewish roots. So I'm going to need this time off. Well, the store manager said, well, I mean, that's kind of surprising because you've never expressed an interest in having time off for your Jewish observances. He goes, well, I've decided to, reconnect. I hadn't been into it, but now I am into it. And then the store manager goes, well, I have several Jewish friends, and while they are observant, they usually don't take time off from work during this time, or at least not several days during this time. Are you sure that's something you need to do? And the manager responded, yes, I really feel like we'll need to really get into the whole customs associated with this. And the store manager came to us and said, do we have to give this off? What we think is going on is that this worker has custody of his young children during this time. He wants to take them on a fun trip. I don't really think he has any intention of doing much that is related to his religious beliefs. And the word was, well, I mean, how can you disprove that? How do you know what he's intending to do? Maybe he has reconnected with his faith, and maybe that's what he's going to do. And so the decision the company made was that yes, he would have to be given that time off. Well, the next year came up, and he did not have custody of his children for that spring break. His ex-wife did. And so the store manager came and goes, are you going to need to have um, uh, the Passover week, which wasn't lined up with spring break anyway? Are you going to want that week off again? He goes, oh no, I have no trouble working that week. So We all had a fair amount of doubt about how sincere his beliefs were, but how could we disprove it? Who were we to say that he hadn't had an epiphany where he decided to suddenly become more religious? And the reality is, we didn't know that. Maybe that truly did happen, and he just kind of lost his enthusiasm over the course of the year. So it's very difficult to contest that a belief is sincerely held. About the only time you can do that is when you have somebody who's willing to testify something like, oh, yeah, Bob told me he was just doing this so we could get this time off. He wasn't really going to do anything religious during his time off. So while this is an important term, I don't want you to make too great of a deal on it and think that you will have the opportunity to challenge people's religious beliefs. It's obviously a distasteful thing to do, and courts are going to be very, very reluctant to do so. We've already had the term undue hardship over here, so I kind of repeated. I'm not quite sure why, but here's a little bit more granularity. I might actually prefer this definition over the other one, so let me just read to you what we have here. A circumstance that excuses an employer from accommodating an employee's religious practices if doing so involves more than ordinary administrative costs, or diminished efficiency of other workers, or infringement on other employees' rights, or impairment of worker safety, or increased work responsibilities for others. Now, I hope you get the impression here, because you should, that this bar is not very high, that things that aren't that big of a deal for the employer can still be considered an undue hardship. So the employer is not required to climb every mountain to help the religious observer. Now, I'm not discouraging employers from doing that at all. What I'm saying is it's not a legal obligation. So if it's going to cost the employer money, you probably don't have to do it. If it's going to affect the productivity of other workers, you probably don't have to do that. If it's going to increase other workers' job responsibilities, you probably don't have to do that. We'll talk about some strategies about meeting this reasonable accommodation without venturing into the undue hardship category. But I just want you to have a sense as to the level of obligation. It's not super great. Now, we use the terms reasonable accommodation and undue hardships for the Americans with Disabilities Act as well. We have to reasonably accommodate people with disabilities up until the point that it becomes an undue hardship. So we use the same terms, but the duty of reasonable accommodation is quite a bit more onerous on employers when we're talking about disability accommodation than when we're talking about religious accommodation. So we're using the same words, but we really use them in a different way. And when we get to the Americans with Disabilities Act, I think that will become more clear. Let's consider the term religious practice or observance. So this is going to include the beliefs, what's in somebody's head and heart, but also the actions, how they pray, when they pray, what they need to pray, how they worship, when they worship, things such as the clothing they wear or the clothing they can't wear, the symbols they might wear, such as a cross or a Star of David. Those types of things would fit into the category of religious practice or observance. It's pretty rare that we see cases that, somebody is saying it qualifies as a religious practice or observance and it ends up not being a religious practice or observance. This is a pretty large term. It's defined broadly. So there's relatively few things that don't fit into this that kind of seem a little bit like religion. We already have the reasonable accommodation definition from before. Let's see how this one stacks up with the other definition. This one might also be a little bit better. An employer must make reasonable adjustments to the work environment to permit an applicant or employee to practice his or her religious beliefs. This is where we get into the undue hardship level. And this is an important term, de minimis. The de minimis cost for accommodation. This is really any expense that isn't trivial that the employer has to bear in order to provide a religious accommodation. If it's more than de minimis, it's going to qualify as an undue hardship in the area of religious discrimination. Again, that's not at all the standard for disability discrimination. So if the employer is out $100, that's not de minimis. And so that would qualify as an undue hardship. And then the ministerial exemption, which we've already talked about, it's an exemption that prevents the application to clergy members of Title VII. Now, this exemption isn't just to do with religion. I mean, that kind of automatically makes sense. If I want to hire a Jewish rabbi, I'm not going to accept a Lutheran who applies for the job. I'm not going to accept an atheist who applies for the job. I'm not going to accept a Hindu who applies for the job. I'm going to reasonably want somebody of the Jewish faith. That's pretty obvious that you're going to restrict it to your religion, and not just your religion, but your very narrowly defined religion. So again, going back to the Jewish rabbi, if my synagogue is Orthodox, I'm not going to consider a Reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi. I'm going to want an Orthodox rabbi. Or if my congregation is Presbyterian, I'm not going to hire a Lutheran or a Catholic person to be our religious leader. I'm going to hire a Presbyterian. And it can even be more granular because there's more than one category of Presbyterian, there's more than one category of Orthodox Jew, as would be true for most faiths. So this one is pretty intuitive, but it's actually a broader exemption than just relating to religion. Under Title VII, religious organizations or ministers are not protected against race, sex, or national origin discrimination by their congregations. And you may say, well, gosh, why would any church or synagogue or mosque want to discriminate against somebody based upon their race or their sex or their national origin? And why would we let them if even if they wanted to do that? Well, let's consider the sex aspect for just a second. There are some faiths that take the view that women have a certain role in the religion, and that's different than the role that men have. So, for example, in the Catholic Church, women can't become priests, and men can't become nuns. Men can become monks, but they can't become nuns. I think only men can become deacons in the Catholic Church. And then I think in the Orthodox Jewish faith, only men can become rabbis. So there are some sex-specific roles that exist in certain religions. And so to tell the Catholic Church, well, this woman here is more qualified to become a priest than this man, well, the Catholic Church would say, yes, I mean, she's highly skilled, highly trained, she knows the theology, she's got excellent interpersonal skills, but the fact she's a woman is a deal breaker for the Catholic Church. And so you could see how if you didn't have the sex exemption, the Catholic Church wouldn't be able to function according to its theological understanding of itself. Now, the race and national origin is perhaps a little bit less intuitive, but you can even see that there are some religions. You see this with the Jewish faith, and to a lesser degree, you may see it in the Greek Orthodox Church or some other churches like that, where there is an ethnic component to the religious experience. So, for example, in the Jewish faith, there may be a cultural manifestations of that. So if you had somebody who was not culturally part, maybe theologically part of the community, but not culturally part of the community, then that might be a source of tension, a source of the community not being able to come together quite as well as the parishioners want. But I think the real reason why these are included doesn't have to do so much with race or national origin itself, but it has to do with the First Amendment. And this is the idea that the Congress didn't want the court system, which of course is an arm of the government, to be telling religious entities how they are supposed to staff their leadership. Because, of course, we have a separation of church and state, as we said before. Well, it's pretty hard to have separation of church and state if you can have a court come in and say, you have to hire that particular person to be your religious leader. Well, whoever's the religious leader is obviously going to set the theological tone, uh, the program tone for what's going on in that particular congregation. And so basically then the government would be telling that particular congregation, this is how we want you to worship. Well, again, you wouldn't really have the freedom of the separation of church and state at that point. So it's really a First Amendment issue to a large extent. Okay, so now we've completed the first section, which is kind of an introduction to terminology relating to religious discrimination. And now we're going to do a dive into what is religion? What do we mean when we use that term? You know, it's such a basic term, we use it pretty regularly. It's not a complicated word in the English language. And yet, if you were to ask the average person, well, what does religion mean to you? You're likely to hear different things. And part of that may be that person's own faith journey and what that term means. So let's get started talking about it from a legal standpoint. I guess the first thing to note is that the Title VII actually does not define religion. So we don't have something we can point to in the statute that says, this is what these words mean. And that's kind of unusual because usually important words are defined in statutes. And I think the reason why it probably wasn't defined was because it's open to so many different interpretations. And I'm guessing the Congress at that point didn't want to commit to a particular term. As I said before, though, if somebody is saying that there's a religious issue here, it's going to be rare that a court is going to say, nope, don't think that's religion. Think you're mistaken. Think it's something else. That would be unusual to have that. Eventually, Title VII was amended, so we have a definition, includes, and this is the definition that came, again, first in 1964, there was no definition, but it was amended to include this definition. All aspects of religious observance and practice as well as belief. So we have religious observance, practice, and belief. Unless an employer demonstrates is unable to reasonably accommodate, so this is the upward limit without undue hardship on the conduct of the employer's business. So it covers not only the belief system, but how that belief is expressed through words and deeds. Now, most of the time, I would say 90+% of the cases are going to be when the employer refuses to give or to accommodate an employee's particular religious observances. So there's not a lot in the belief area. There are times where it can arise, and we actually may see more of that in the future. But for the time being, it's usually about days off, times off from work for religious observance, and when the employee wants to wear specialized clothing or jewelry or wants to not wear something along those lines. Those are the most common ways that we see these cases developing. So obviously religion for many people is kind of a defining aspect of who they are. It is who that person is in a very deep sense. So we're really talking about a core value, perhaps even more core to many people than their ethnic identity, their racial identity, their gender. It can be a very, very basic aspect of who they are. This is how the EOC defines the term religious. And again, the EOC is the agency that interprets the Title VII. So here we have moral and ethical beliefs as to what is right and wrong, which are sincerely held with the strength of religious views. So you can see here, the EOC is not limiting it to traditional religious views. They're not saying, well, we've got Christianity here, we've got Judaism here, we've got Islam here, we've got Hinduism here, we've got other belief systems here that are defined and well known. No, they say even things that don't maybe initially appear to be a religion can be protected out here. So it's a very broad and encompassing way to look at that term. So some things that maybe at first thought you might think, oh, that seems more like a philosophical belief versus a religious beliefs. For example, you don't need to have a belief in a deity. There are some religions, for example, Buddhism, that perhaps don't have an actual deity necessarily associated with it. You may be surprised to know that atheism, for the purpose of this definition, is a form of religious belief. So is agnosticism. Opposition to abortion by itself can be a religious belief. Obviously, many religions do oppose abortion. So, for example, you could be a Catholic person and oppose abortion in part because you're Catholic. But even if you had no other religious beliefs, you didn't believe in a God, you didn't go to any particular place of worship, you had no scriptures, but you happened to oppose abortion and it met this definition, then that could qualify as a religious belief. Another thing is that the religion of the person claiming it doesn't have to be popular, organized, or established. In fact, I can establish my own religion. I might be the only person who believes exactly what I believe. And that doesn't make it, in some sense, any less protected than any other religion. Again, the employer can't question the sincerity of belief merely because the religion seems odd or unpopular. It's not really relevant whether how many people believe this way and how similar the practices are to other faiths. So let's consider this scenario. So Bob seeks a reasonable accommodation for religious practice unique to his group, and they're called the Faithful Disciples. Bob's employer has never heard of this religion. In order to determine whether Bob's demand for accommodation is truly based on his religion, his employer must determine whether Bob's belief is sincerely held and whether it occupies the place of religion in his life. As I said before, this is not going to be a helpful thing. So I don't encourage the employer to spend much time on this at all. Now, this one might be a legitimate thing to explore. If you start finding out that what faithful disciples are into is Dungeons and Dragons, and that's what they do, they play Dungeons and Dragons together, I'm not sure that's a religion. Or let's say what they do is they are very involved in political things, and they're really just a political group who has a certain political ideology. Again, maybe that's not a religion. So this one might be worthy of asking a bit of information about it from Bob. But at the end of the day, again, the definition is very, very broad. So here again is that definition. The belief should occupy the same place in life of the worker as an orthodox belief in God holds in the life of one clearly qualified. So if you think about people you know who are religious and you think about whatever their religion might be, you think about the role that God has in their life as they define God, then you're looking when you're trying to establish whether this particular faith, maybe it's faithful disciples, maybe it's another belief system, does it have that same position for people? Does its belief system occupy in that same way? One thing that we see is that the worker never has to compromise her faith. For example, let's say that ordinarily workers in this particular facility need to work every Friday. That's just the deal. Someone comes in and says, well, in my religion, I'm not supposed to work on Fridays. Okay. Well, the boss comes back and goes, listen, I think I can swing it so you only have to work every other Friday. And we'll just let you, on the maybe you'll work a couple of hours more over the weeks to make up for that time. I can swing that, but I can't let you have every Friday off. Well, if the requirement of the faith is that the worker have every Friday off, it's not a reasonable accommodation to require that he or she break his or her faith only half as much as they initially were doing that. So that would not be a reasonable accommodation of the faith. Another thing is that the worker does not have to explain his or her religious beliefs or practices. Now, they need to explain it sufficiently so you understand what needs to be accommodated, but they don't need to explain it in a sense of justifying it. They don't need to, for example, imagine that uh, you, and this is comes up pretty commonly. You might have a workforce that is predominantly Christian, and maybe the manager is also of the Christian faith and perhaps is fairly religious. And one of the workers says, "Well, I don't feel like I can work on Sundays anymore." Well, the manager goes, "Well, I mean, I go to church every Sunday, but once I'm out of church, I feel like I can go to work. So I can be at work by 12:30. I don't see why you can't also do that. Why can't you do that if I can do that? I've even talked to my minister. He says it's fine that as long as I go to church, that I can go to work afterwards." Um, the worker doesn't have to justify or point to scriptures or show a letter from his or her religious leader that supports that particular interpretation. Now, obviously, the worker needs to explain what's required to accommodate. So that in that case, the worker has explained by saying, "I can't work on Sundays." That's the level of detail that the worker needs to provide. If the worker is associated with a particular religious group, he or she does not have to have exactly the same views. So it might be that uh, worker actually goes to the same church that the manager goes to. So the manager might be tempted to say, "Wait a second, you and I go to the same church. We have the same minister. My minister says it's fine to work after church. Why don't you go talk to our minister because he'll set you straight?" Well, it's okay that this worker who goes to worship at a church with a minister who thinks it's okay to work on Fridays, it's okay that that parishioner actually doesn't agree with his minister. It's fine that in his view that that's sinful, even though the official teachings of that particular congregation might be in conflict with what he's saying. Let's consider this scenario. So Bob works as a desk clerk at a hotel, and this hotel has several requirements for its desk clerk. It requires its employees to be on time for work, to take bathroom breaks on a specific schedule, to observe certain dress codes, and the male employees need to be clean shaven. Unfortunately, Bob isn't the best employee. He's consistently late to work, doesn't have good excuses. He doesn't follow the break schedule. Anyway, one day he shows up to work with a beard. And his manager says, "Hey, we don't allow beards here. You have to be clean shaven." Well, Bob says he has a new religious belief that requires that he wear a beard. The manager tells him, "Hey, you got to get with the program here. That's a bunch of hooey." Well, under those circumstances, that's not what, I guess I should have said hotel here. That's not what the hotel manager should say. Again, it's very difficult to question the sincerity of the belief that Bob has, unless again you can identify a coworker that will say, "Oh, Bob told me this was all a scam," or something along those lines. And so it is not probably the most productive way to tell Bob that he needs to be clean shaven, because it seems like that's probably a religious view that can be reasonably accommodated. We see uh, uh, beards being a reason, permitting the use of beards to be a reasonable accommodation in several cases. These usually come up with Sikhs, people, males of the Jewish faith, and Muslim males. It is a requirement in the Sikh religion that men and women don't cut their hair. For the Jewish faith and the Muslim faith, it is not as much of a religious requirement, but it is considered a good thing, uh, a appropriate thing to do, a laudable thing to do. And Domino's Pizza used to have a policy that it wanted all of its drivers to be clean shaven, and their justification for that is that when a delivery person shows up at your door, that can be kind of an intimidating thing. You are opening your door to them. You're in some sense in a vulnerable position. This delivery driver could, you know, kidnap you or harm you or shoot you or do something bad to you. And so Domino's position was, we want our delivery people to be as unintimidating as possible. And sometimes people find beards to be intimidating, or at least to obscure the face, so it's a little harder to see who you're dealing with. And so that was the logic behind Domino's no beards policy. But the courts have said that when it is a religious obligation, or at least a good thing in that religion, to have a beard, the employer should, Domino's needs to reasonably accommodate that. Another situation where we see this same issue coming up is that there is a skin condition that some African American men have because of the texture of the beard hair. If men who have this condition shave, instead of the beard hair growing out of the hair follicle, you know, and developing length outside of the body, the hair can actually grow into the skin, and it can result in uh, painful and disfiguring lumps where the hair is ingrown into the skin, almost like a splinter or something. And so some African American men who have this condition obviously want to have a beard so that they don't have this painful condition. And even though there is no duty to reasonably accommodate race, uh, to have a policy that um, uh, puts African Americans at a disadvantage in that sense could be considered to have a disparate impact upon African Americans, because um, it would be a very, very rare condition for Caucasians or Asians to have. And so a no beard policy would have a disparate impact upon African Americans. So the no beard issue can actually also play a role for African Americans, even if the African American isn't considering the beard for religious purposes. Obviously, if he is also Jewish or also Muslim or also Sikh, then that would be an additional reason why he might want to have the beard. This is an interesting case. It's local to our, fairly local to us. It's a Houston case. Those of y'all that are in my generation might remember when we used to have savings and loans in Texas. This was one in the Houston area. In this case, Miss Young is an atheist, and you can say this is back a long time ago. And she and her coworkers would attend a monthly meeting at a central location. So all of the branches of the savings and loan would meet together. And at the beginning of this session, there would be a short religious talk and a prayer. Young had no problem attending the business portion of the meeting, but because she was an atheist, she did not want to attend the religious aspects. So she brought this to her manager's attention and said, hey, I don't want to attend anymore. The manager said, you got to attend. And she says, well, no, I don't have to. I'm not going to attend. And so she ended up submitting a letter of resignation, or she was asked to submit a letter of resignation, but she refused. She says, I'm being fired. The manager said, no, you're not being fired. But Young left at that point and never came back. And so she filed a lawsuit saying, yes, I was discriminated against because of my atheism. Atheism is, for the purposes of Title VII, a religion. I should have been reasonably accommodated by allowing me to arrive into the meeting after the religious parts had been completed. Now, there's an additional fact about this case that I didn't include in this document, and that is that actually ended up that there were people who the supervisor didn't know about who had requested to not attend the religious portion of the meeting, and that request had been accommodated. Now, the supervisor, I think, genuinely didn't know that that accommodation was available. Um, but that option was not offered to Young. And so the court concluded that yes, atheism can be a religion, again, if it meets that definition. Title VII protects the right to believe as well as the right not to believe. And we'll talk more about the prima facie case for religious discrimination. But in this case, Young satisfied it because she was a person who was a member of a particular religious belief system, that being atheism. Now, you don't need to know this case, it's not an especially important case, but you need to know the idea that agnosticism and atheism are both protected. And let me just define those terms for you. Atheism is the belief that there is no God. Agnosticism is when a person saying, I don't know, or perhaps it's impossible to know whether there is a God or not. It's an open question for me, and maybe I believe it will always be an open question. Maybe I think I'll eventually reach a decision. So these are the two terms that can qualify as religious beliefs. This case is crazy. I'm just going to lay it down for you. This one is very, very strange. The question that this case answers is an employee always required to inform an employer of religious views in order to sue for religious discrimination? Now, the common sense answer you're probably thinking is, well, yeah, how can you discriminate against somebody if you don't know what their religion is? You know, you can see how you can discriminate against someone because of their gender or their race, because usually by looking at somebody, you have a pretty good idea what their race and their gender is. You can even discriminate against somebody because of their age, because oftentimes it's pretty obvious whether that person is under or over 40. But you can't usually tell somebody's religion unless they wear religious jewelry or they talk about their religion. There isn't a sign that a person, is of a particular religion. Well, I think the importance of this case, or the exception to this case, really turns on the very strange facts in this case. So let's consider the facts a little bit, but keeping in mind that no, this case is not a tremendously important case in the area of religious liberty or religious discrimination. So this is a police department, and there was an employee named Venters. I don't think we really ever hear what her religion is. My guess is that she was at least nominally Christian, but I don't know that she was especially religious. Anyway, her manager is Ives, and Ives is a very religious man who identifies himself as a born-again Christian. Ives does not agree with Venter's lifestyle. He thinks that she is engaging in all kinds of misconduct, premarital sex, um, just leading a bad example in lots of different senses. He thinks that Venters has gotten involved in a cult, although where he got that idea from is really, really unclear. He is disapproving of some of the programming that Venters watches, and eventually she's demoted, and eventually she's fired. But before she's fired, her boss is claiming that she is engaging in incest and bestiality, and maybe she's even sacrificing animals to Satan. Very strange set of belief systems going on here. I'm not sure. Maybe Venters was doing some of these things. Maybe she wasn't. But anyway, Ives thought she was doing it. Anyway, so Venters is eventually fired, allegedly because of her poor performance. But as you can imagine, being told these things certainly clouded the water in terms of what the real motivation was. And so the court concluded that the evidence was adequate to permit Venter's Title VII claims of discriminatory discharge to proceed to trial, because Ives was being so aggressive about criticizing Venter's lifestyle that Ives' imposition of his religious views was essentially uh, discriminating against Venter, whatever her religious views might be. You don't need to know the name of this case. It's just yet another example of these types of cases um, that can arise, especially with respect to proselytizing. So if you're trying to decide whether something is a religion or not, here are some good questions to ask yourself. Is it an inherent characteristic of someone? So, for example, race can't be a religion. It might be that many people of a particular race share a religion. Nationality can't be a religion. Even in a country like Israel that is identified as a Jewish state, about 10% of the population are Muslims or Christians. And certainly, I'm sure there are atheists and other individuals in that uh, uh, country. So, nationality is not the same thing as religion. We also can't say appearances having a certain physical characteristic, nor can medical condition be considered the same thing as a religion. To some extent, religion involves some choice. I can choose to believe this religion or not. Um, Another thing to look at is there faith involved in it? Are there values involved in this? Moral codes? Is there a core identification to a particular, worldview that's in play? These would point us to the idea of it being a religion. We've already kind of talked about these ideas. Is the belief sincere and closely held? And here, when I'm using the word closely, I mean it in the sense of sincerely. Again, an employer is not too smart if it attempts to judge sincerity unless there's some reason that you think that there's strong evidence that it may be insincere. Then the next question is, does it, whatever the belief is, does it take the role of religion in that person's life? Atheism, as we said before, can be a religion. Strangely, white supremacy has been held by some courts to be a religion. So again, there's all kinds of beliefs, some of them obviously pretty repugnant to most human beings, but that doesn't change the fact that it may be a religion for some folks. This is, it's not an important case, but I think I think it's a very good case to talk about because it really helps us kind of go through what the usual stumbling blocks are for employers in this situation. So we have a Boyer. He is the plaintiff. The EOC is suing on his behalf, but he's essentially the plaintiff. And he works at a beef processing plant. He has no trouble working on Saturdays until he converts to Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventist is a Christian denomination that instead of worshiping on the first day, Sunday, they continue to worship on the seventh day, the Saturday, in keeping with the Jewish ties that Christianity has. And so their holy day, their day of worship, is the Saturday, and that's why they're called Seventh-day Adventists. So after he converts to this denomination, he informs his employer that he can no longer work on Saturdays. Well, as you can imagine, there's lots of people in this meat processing plant who would prefer to have their Saturdays off. As you can imagine, most people would say, well, gosh, that's when my kids are off school. That's when my spouse is off work. I want Saturdays off too. So you can see the challenge that employers have. If they give Boyer Saturday off, they may suddenly find a lot of other workers are pretty angry. How does he get Saturday off and I don't? You can see how that could be a problem. in the workplace, having some tension there. So his supervisors, again, meet with him to discuss ways of accommodating his religious beliefs. This is an important conversation to have, and it very likely will need to be more than one conversation. How to figure out exactly what, is Boyer's religious obligations, do they start at sundown on Friday and end at sundown on Saturday? Is it uh, prohibited that he do any work on that time, or are there periods during that time where he might be free to work? Again, asking these types of questions, um, figuring out different ways of accommodating it. So at first, it wasn't a problem because Saturday work in this facility uh, didn't happen every single Saturday. But when Saturday's work was coming up, the employer said, listen, why don't you trade shifts? If you're scheduled on a Saturday, find somebody who's not scheduled on that Saturday and see if you can work their Thursday shift, and then they'll work your Saturday shift. This is a very common solution to the person who is unable or unwilling to work a Saturday or Sunday because of religious duties, to put the onus on that person to find someone to swap schedules for. Now, usually the employer isn't required to permit this schedule swap if it's going to get one of the workers into an overtime situation, in other words, over 40 hours a week. So let's imagine that I am not the religious person. I am scheduled to work Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. I work 840 hours. Bob, who's say an example is a Seventh-day Adventist, he's scheduled to work Tuesday through Saturday. He wants to be off that Saturday. He comes to me and says, hey, I'll work your Monday shift if you'll work my Saturday shift. Now, I might say to you, well, I'm not willing to make that change, but I am willing to work your Saturday shift so I can get overtime, but I still want to work my Monday shift. Well, obviously, in that situation, I would be working 48 hours. Those last 8 hours would be at time and a half. Let's say my hourly rate is $10 an hour. For those last 8 hours, I'm going to earn $15 an hour. So it's going to cost my employer $5 extra an hour. 5 times 8 is 40. And that's going to happen for every week that we have this arrangement. And so it's more than a de minimis cost for the employer. So the employer doesn't have to pay that overtime expense. The employer can insist that Bob find someone who's willing to switch hour for hour, so there's not going to be any issue about overtime pay. In this case, Boyer says, no, I can't do that because he considered it a sin to ask somebody to switch. After all, in Boyer's mind, it's a sin for anyone to work on Saturday, not just for him. So if he's going to not work Saturday, for him to be encouraging other people to commit a sin would, in fact, be a sin for him. So then the employer said, well, we'll try to switch up, find people. So we're the one who's going to be asking people to switch schedules. So Boyer said, okay, I'm not sinning then. You're the one sinning, and that's on your conscience. But the employer found that not a lot of people were willing to do this swap. As you can imagine, people didn't really want to work Saturdays if they didn't have to otherwise, especially when they weren't receiving any additional pay. So this effort was unsuccessful, and Boyer missed some Saturdays and ultimately was dismissed. So now Boyer, time goes forward, and he gets a job for another employer. And as he's working for this other employer, he does work on Saturdays. So this makes it seem now like, aha, now we have Boyer, right? He wasn't sincere. He didn't have a sincerely held belief. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been working for this other employer on Saturday. But Boyer had a response for that. He said that he lost his faith. He was in a period of doubt. He wasn't sure about this. And now he is out of that period of doubt. And so, or actually, he left that period of doubt while he was still employed by the old employer. And so he decided eventually that he needed to to miss the Saturdays there as well, and so ultimately he was discharged from that job. So the fact that even after his conversion he was not always consistent does not disprove his sincerity at other times. That's one of the reasons why it's so hard to prove a lack of a sincere belief. So the court held that Boyer's previous absence of faith beliefs and his temporary loss of faith later did not support the conclusion that his beliefs were insincere. And so the plaintiff was successful. Now, again, I don't really have a lot of fault for what the employer did here. The employer, some employers will just ask for shift swaps. Some employers will force people to do the shift swaps. I think that forcing the shift swaps can obviously create some significant morale problems. And so I'm not sure that I agree that Boyer should have won this case. But I do agree with the idea that the fact that he fell away from his faith for a time is not dispositive of other periods of time and his degree of faith at those times. Again, you don't need to know the name of this case. So here are a list of religious practices, some of which seem a little wacky. Ku Klux Klan, is that a religion? Who knows, right? Espousing white supremacy, I already told you what that was, right? So you already know that can be a religion. Wicca, which is associated with the witch culture, is that a religion? Veganism, is that a religion? And listen to this one, a person's legal conclusion, a belief that a social security card is not biblical. Sometimes people say it's the sign of the beast or something along those lines. A belief in cold fusion, could that be a religion? A belief in eating cat food at your desk at work. Doesn't sound like a religion to me. Atheism, is that a religion? Well, here are the answers to these questions. You can see atheism is, belief in cold fusion is, Wiccanism is, white supremacy is, but the others are not. It's hard to know when you're talking about kind of unusual beliefs, and veganism isn't an unusual thing to do, but to see it as a religion probably is somewhat unusual. Now, if a person is a vegan because of his or her religion, for example, many Hindus are vegetarians. If it's part of your religion, then certainly being a Hindu is a religion. And that component of it could also be part of religion. But when I say veganism, I mean just veganism on its own without any other religious ties. That is not considered a religion. So the Ku Klux Klan is not a religion. You might say, well, why is that not a religion if white supremacy is? I don't know. I can't defend these somewhat quirky cases. One of the things you discover when you read enough of these cases is that they aren't always consistent with each other. Honestly, they really aren't. So let me point you to this case. You're not responsible for looking at it, but here's a kind of a summary of it. So in this case, an employer demoted an employee after he appeared in the local newspaper in which he described his religion, his involvement in religion, that felt that the races ought to be kept separate, much like the Ku Klux Klan. So the employer demoted the employee. The employee sued, saying this is religious discrimination. And the court said, yeah, I mean, the faith is a religion, even though the views were consistent with the Ku Klux Klan, the religion itself had enough components to it that met the definition of religion that it is protected. Now you can imagine how uncomfortable that working place would be for people who were, I'm assuming this gentleman was a white person, people who were African American, who would want to work beside this employee after this article has appeared in the newspaper. You can see the challenges that the employer is going to have managing that work relationship. So these problems can be pretty significant. So at this point, I'm going to conclude our lecture. We will, in subsequent lectures, talk about the prima facie case. We'll talk about the duty to reasonably accommodate in more detail, as well as that upper limit undue hardship uh, maximum limit. We'll talk about religious proselytizing and also the topic of religious harassment. We'll talk about unions' duties with respect to religion. And finally, we'll talk about religious organizations and how Title VII treats them. I hope that this presentation has been helpful for you. I appreciate your attention. As always, if you have questions about any of these topics, please feel free to pop into my office hours. I'd be glad to talk about them in more detail with you. Again, have a wonderful day and thanks.